Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP U.S. History. As today we look at how to fight a war, you need to be able to do more than just fight the war. Now, although the North and South were both founded by much the same peoples and shared much the same heritage, their similarities barely masked many differences, and the regional specialization that had developed during the Market Revolution had not left the separate regions equal. The Confederate Constitution was much like the Union Constitution, although with a few differences, mostly minor. The president had a single 6-year term and a line-item veto, for example. However, its philosophical basis had a significant weakness. The Confederacy, after all, was a nation based on states' rights. The Confederate Army was made up almost entirely of state-raised regiments based on the militia system, which would consistently have trouble getting militias to fight outside their native states. While Confederate soldiers froze in Virginia during the winter, warehouses full of uniforms sat untouched in North Carolina. Soldiers from some parts of the Confederacy would starve, while civilians would eat very well behind the battle lines in other parts of the Confederacy. This was partly due to poor transportation networks in the South, but partly to states' rights. Georgia's governor, for example, was so recalcitrant, he often tried to manage his own state to such an extent, some feared he would secede from the South and fight the Yankees and the rebels at once. President Jefferson Davis had not really wanted his position. He'd been officer in the Mexican War and Franklin Pierce's Secretary of War, and he wanted to command an army, not manage a cabinet. Although he could be a good public speaker and could be a good administrator, in some ways, too, he wasn't. He did not get along well with Congress. He did not get along well with his vice president, Alexander Stephens. He did not get along well with many of his generals, although he got along very well with and protected his close friend Braxton Bragg, a fellow hero of the Battle of Buena Vista in Mexico, and he would be very reluctant to remove Bragg from command, despite the fact that his management of the Army of Tennessee was often viewed as very poor, and he was unpopular with his men and the generals under his command. Although Davis was a man of integrity who worked hard at his job, he was not a popular or a successful leader, and by the end of the war would be hated in the South almost as much as in the North. Although Abraham Lincoln was not initially respected much either, yet his cabinet often didn't get along with each other or with him. He had a reputation as a hick, a mixed record as a public speaker. Although capable of arguing quite brilliantly, his grammar, his accent, and sometimes other elements too were against him. His speeches are remembered so well today, partly because of his own personal prestige, lending them gravitas they were not seen to have at the time, partly because reporters sometimes cleaned up his grammar out of sympathy, although some, to be sure, were remarkably powerful in their own right. Although foreign diplomats who saw him on the street early on sometimes had to be told that he was the president of the United States. Again, he was such a homely-looking and often poorly dressed fellow. But beneath a rough exterior was a brilliant mind, and he was a devious schemer. He could be charming in private, told funny stories, sometimes to such an extent people got tired of his stories. And he was very patient with his cabinet, despite their open contempt for him, especially early in his presidency. Of his Secretary of War's criticism of him, he said, "Did Stanton say I'm a damned fool? Then I dare say I must be one, for Stanton's generally right and always says what he means." Lincoln was also willing to bend and stretch the law of the land to fight the emergency, and was allowed to do so by Republican colleagues in the Congress. In his call for volunteers, Lincoln enlarged the size of the Army, which is the prerogative of Congress. He had the Secretary of Treasury at one point give 3 private citizens $2 million to spend on the war, even though only Congress can decide how money is to be spent. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, so he could arrest pro-Confederate men in several states without warrants. When the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court criticized this, Lincoln threatened to arrest him too. Lincoln shut down newspapers, had the Army supervise voting, and established martial law in Maryland. Although he still faced opposition from Democrats, especially the Irish immigrants who did not want to fight to free slaves who might compete with them for low-wage jobs. He also faced, in New York City in particular, although elsewhere, he faced opposition from farmers in the Midwest, especially the southern Midwest, notably Indiana, those close to the Ohio River, who were often more closely tied economically and culturally to the South than to the North. The Democrats who sympathized with the South were known as Copperheads, taking their name either from the copper pennies with the head of liberty they sometimes wore on their coats as a symbol, or named for the venomous snake, who assumed they were all spies and traitors, although in fact only a few were, but some were impressively so. In January of 1861, Fernando Wood, the Democratic mayor of New York City and later congressman from New York City, proposed that New York City, which in those days was just Manhattan, although he would have included some neighboring towns, now boroughs of New York City, secede from the United States and become its own free city, which he would have called Tri-Insula, for the three islands, Manhattan Island, Staten Island, and part of Long Island, that would have been included in this free state. He wanted New York to be able to continue its profitable role in the cotton trade. And throughout the war, he opposed conflict with the South. When he became a congressman from New York, he opposed the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. The most outspoken Copperhead of all was a congressman from Ohio, Clement Vallandigham. Vallandigham made many criticisms of Lincoln's administration. In a particularly inflammatory speech in 1863, he described Lincoln's war as a grand experiment on a scale the most costly and gigantic in its proportions, of creating love by force, developing fraternal affection by war. Lincoln eventually had Vallandigham tried in a military court, despite him being a civilian, which years later the Supreme Court would say was illegal, and had him exiled to the South, using a leftover part of the Alien Acts of 1798. He eventually made his way to Canada, where he campaigned remotely for the governorship of Ohio, winning a large part of the vote, although not a majority. He was allowed to come back home in 1864, where he continued to cause trouble, once spitting on a military decree and joining the Knights of the Golden Circle, a pro-Southern group that at one point tried to liberate Confederate prisoners of war. Still, Vallandigham was mostly left alone after his return home. He returned to his law practice, eventually shooting himself fatally with a revolver used as evidence in a trial, trying to prove it could not have been used to commit suicide, disproving his own point. Now, in the beginning, the war effort on both sides depended on volunteers, and both sides initially supplied them in abundance. Here we can see recruiting stations on Gay Street in Knoxville, with a Union recruiting station at one end of the street and a Confederate station at the other end, both drawing large crowds. But over time, both sides began to run low on volunteers. By 1862, the South was running low, and the North by 1863. And so both sides passed conscription laws, the first nationwide draft in the United States, or Confederate States. This brought new men into service, but in some cases, especially in the South, it also kept volunteers who had signed up for a certain term of enlistment from going home when their term was up. In both North and South, anyone who could afford it could hire a substitute to take his place in the Army. In the North, it was possible to pay a $300 commutation fee to avoid service. In the South, fear of slave insurrections was so great that anyone who owned or served as an overseer of 20 slaves was allowed to stay home to make sure the slaves stayed down on the farm. On both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, these methods of avoiding the draft created deep resentment. Private Sam Watkins of Company H, the 1st Tennessee Regiment in the Confederate Army, explained that a law was made by the Confederate States Congress at this time allowing every person who owned 20 Negroes to go home. It gave us the blues. We wanted 20 Negroes. Negro property suddenly became very valuable, and there was raised the howl of rich man's war, poor man's fight. Again, a complaint heard in the North as well, most famously in New York City, where Manhattan itself was predominantly Democratic, although Brooklyn quite Republican. The immigrants in New York City in particular did not feel this was their fight. And when the first names were drawn for the draft in July of 1863, riots broke out. Mobs made up largely of Irish New Yorkers rioted from July 11th to July 13th, doing between $1.5 and $2 million in property damage, killing at least 50 people, most of them black people, whom the rioters blamed for the war. Eventually, the draft riots were put down by the U.S. Army, including soldiers who came over directly from the Battle of Gettysburg to fight the rioters. There were no draft riots in the South, but there were bread riots, as Southerners ran low on money and to buy. Mary Jackson in Richmond led women in a bread riot on April 2nd, 1863, and that was not the only bread riot in the South. In the South, too, conscription agents were often reluctant to go into the Appalachian Mountains, where there were many Union sympathizers, and a conscription agent might not come back out. To finance the war, the North had some distinct advantages over the South. The North was richer to begin with, and was also bigger, and so had a bigger tax base. The United States passed the first nationwide income tax in 1862 and raised the tax over the course of the war. Initially in 1862, it was a 3% flat tax on incomes between $600 and $10,000 per year, $600 being about 60,000 in today's money. There was a 5% flat tax on incomes over $10,000, which would probably be about $1 million in today's money. This tax lasted till 1872, when it was brought to a close. There was an attempt to revive the income tax in 1894, but the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional in 1895. Now, to bring in revenue and to protect the manufacturing interests that supported the war and supported the Republican Party, and with no Southern Democrats to block them, the Republicans raised tariffs while in charge. The Morrill Tariff Act of 1861 increased the tariff by between 5 to 10%, depending on the taxed good, up to about 27%, higher than it had been in some time, although still lower than it was in the 1820s and 30s. Later tariffs would raise it even higher, and the government and manufacturers would grow wealthy. To pay for the war, the federal government printed paper money, notes known as greenbacks, backed only by the ink they were printed with. As the Union's credit went up and down, usually based on successes or defeats on the battlefield, so did the value of greenbacks, so at one point they fell to an actual value of 39 cents on the dollar. The government also made money through the sale of bonds, essentially IOUs, that you would purchase and be repaid sometime later with interest. To prevent private banks from flooding the market with poorly regulated paper money, as they had done so often and for so long, the U.S. government passed the National Bank Act in 1863, another one in 1864, to standardized banknotes. Banks that joined, and it was technically voluntary, but banks that joined the new national banking system, essentially a third bank of the United States, could buy government bonds and use those to back their paper money, making it more reliable and a standard value. And this, combined with the independent Treasury, which it partly replaced, served as the basis of the nation's banking system until 1913. The South also printed paper money. The South also sold bonds. The South even levied a tax on farm produce. For a country that was opposed to a strong central government, the South would in some ways develop a stronger central government than the North, or at least attempt to, although states' rights would sometimes thwart those efforts. But The South printed even more paper money than the North, and especially late in the war, and the Confederacy seemed pretty likely to lose, Confederate paper money badly devalued. The South suffered terrible inflation. By the end of the war, Confederate money might be worth as little as 1.6 cents on the dollar. Even in 1863, a barrel of flour cost $100 or more in Richmond, Virginia, one of the main causes of the Richmond bread riot that year. Northern manufacturers made a fortune during the war, especially those in war industries, many of whom cheated the government outrageously, often getting away with it by paying kickbacks to politicians. And this graft was much worse in the North than the South, although mostly because in the North there was more money to steal. Some Northern manufacturers, many, made uniforms out of shoddy or shoddy wool, a type of wool made from leftover scraps from the main wool making process, often recycled or remanufactured wool. That was so cheap that it often tore. Indeed, shoddy came to be a term simply meaning of poor quality. In the South, where uniforms in principle were gray, the dyes used to make them were so cheap they often faded to a brown color described as butternut. Shoes sometimes had cardboard soles. The dried or desiccated vegetables packaged and shipped to soldiers were so disgusting they were sometimes called not desiccated vegetables but desecrated vegetables. Profiteering was so great that many Northerners became millionaires supplying the war effort, a term that had existed since the 1700s but rarely been used before, as there wasn't much need for a common term to describe someone worth $1 million or more. But because many of them made their fortunes by cheating the government with low-quality products that hurt American soldiers, they were described as shoddy millionaires. To outfit the Army, factories used sewing machines, a fairly new invention, to speed up the creation of uniforms to fit soldiers quickly, because you can't really measure to fit uniforms for hundreds of thousands of men. They developed standard sizes for men's clothing. And during the war, the West was growing more populous and more wealthy. The mechanical reaper fed the Army. The Homestead Act of 1862, passed by a Republican Congress who had wanted to provide homesteads, meant settlers were flooding west. And women, of course, assisted the war effort. They served as clerks, some even worked in factories. Some worked as spies, and some were executed in that role. Many served as nurses. Dorothea Dix was superintendent of nurses for the U.S. Army and organized the Sanitary Commission. Not Dorothea Dix, pardon me, but it was organized by Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman in the United States to receive a medical degree. Under her leadership, the Sanitary Commission investigated the U.S. Army and helped Army camps make their camps cleaner and safer for the soldiers. Clara Barton also worked as a nurse for the North during the Civil War, and eventually would organize some years after the war the creation of the American Red Cross, expanding from a European organization. These were all Northern women, but Confederate women made their own clothing. They knitted socks for soldiers, as did Northern women too. Many women opened their homes as private hospitals. Sally Tompkins of Richmond was awarded the rank of captain in the Confederate Army by Jefferson Davis for running her own private hospital. Phoebe Pember, a wealthy Jewish widow from Charleston, South Carolina, opened the Chimborazo Military Hospital in Richmond, a private hospital and the largest hospital in the world at the time. But over the course of the war, the South would be devastated. The South would lose 250,000 men. Fewer men in the North, but a larger percentage of the population. At least 4.5% of the South's entire population was killed in the war. And the South was destroyed economically. Fortunes were lost in Confederate bonds and paper money. The Union blockade cut off the South's economy. cutting off cotton sales. All at one point, the Confederacy cut off her own sales of cotton to Britain and other countries to try to demonstrate how much they needed it. Bales of cotton sat uselessly in warehouses, which would depress the price of cotton for years after the war, too. After the war, the average Southern income would be 40% that of the average Northerner, and would stay that way for the rest of the century or longer. Transportation systems in the South, already more limited than those in the North, collapsed. Railroads were destroyed. Some Southern women cut off their hair to sell overseas to make wigs, although the blockade made that difficult. And of course, the end of slavery would mean that $2 billion, back when that was a lot of money, invested in slaves, would be gone forever. Before the war, Louisiana, which is the richest state in the Union, after the war, the poorest. The Anaconda Plan had done its work.